Welcome to the First Responder Wellness Podcast. This is episode number 76. I'm your host, Conrad, and I'm so grateful that you've joined us today. My mission here on this show is to bring you content that inspires you to live a life of wellness. Because as I often say, wellness is not optional. If you want to be your best in whatever profession you are, whether you're a first responder or whether you're a filmmaker or a podcast host or whatever you do, if you want to serve people and be at your best, you have to first take care of you. So that's what my goal is here. Erin Maccabee and Cinnamon Reiheld are the dynamic duo behind the podcast After the Tones Drop. You've likely heard of them or heard their podcast. And today they are going to be my guest right here on the First Responder Wellness Podcast. We met a few months ago, and actually about a year ago now, at a conference in Kentucky, and I really enjoyed their presentation and got to hang out with them and get to learn to know their passion and their mission to help first responders. And even then, when I met them, I knew I was going to have them on the show. And so finally we were able to arrange that. And so today's whole episode is my conversation with Erin and Cinnamon. And we talk about a lot of things. And we talk about why some people just turn into asshats. And, you know, sometimes it's not because they are that. It's sometimes because it's the job that causes that. And so we talk about that at length. So stay tuned for this informative and sometimes funny conversation. Hey, before we dive into my conversation with Erin and Cinnamon, I want to invite you to leave a rating and a review. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can do that there. If you listen on Spotify, you can do that there. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment below and let me know what you think about the show. Just leave some information that will help others discover the show, because your rating, your reviews really help this show gain visibility. If this show means a lot to you, if it has helped you in any way, I would love to hear that, and others would love to hear that too. So leave that in the comments, in the show notes. I really appreciate that. Now, let's get into my conversation with Erin Maccabee and Cinnamon Reiheld. Cinnamon, Erin, welcome to the First Responder Wellness Podcast. Thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having us.
Gosh, it's about time, isn't it?
It is about time. How many months did I beg you guys to come on board?
It has. Well, we saw you in May.
Yes, a year ago, right?
Right, a year ago in May, with all these
then
brilliant
we saw
ideas.
Didn't we see you again then? After May, or is it okay?
I don't recall.
Shit,
because that was in Kentucky, right? Was that in Kentucky? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
At that symposium. I think that's the only time I've seen you.
Okay. I was hoping that there was another time, so it actually hadn't been nearly a year of what you call begging, what we call seeing our schedule conflict over and over and over.
Well, I know mine too. Yeah. So
we didn't require the begging. You didn't eventually beg enough. It was just our schedules made it a possibility.
So I do appreciate you guys coming on board. So for the uninitiated, tell me who you are and what do you do?
Well, it depends. Depends on who's asking. No. Well, I'm Erin Maccabee, and I am a first responder clinician and integration coach and one of the co-hosts of After the Tones Drop. And that is... I'm introducing. I'm handing the mic to you.
Oh, okay. That is. I thought you were saying that is as far as what the podcast is, and I was like, I cannot wait to hear what she says the podcast is.
Yes, After the Tones Drop is a podcast, right? It's not a TV show. It's not a it's a podcast.
It's not a vlog.
Right.
So After the Tones Drop, I'm gonna step in and work my way backwards. After the Tones Drop is a podcast that is a little bit niche, kind of like you, and our focus is working to introduce and add to first responder mental health, that conversation, and reducing the stories that we have around why first responders should not have wellness issues after doing this job for a very long time, or the fact that it shouldn't interrupt the rest of their lives. And so I am Erin's co-host on that podcast, and my name is Cinnamon. And I am also a first responder trauma therapist with a company that I started in 2017 called Whole House Counseling and Consultation, which was kind of the beginning of this. And since then, we've added the podcast. And we also now just started, I feel like we need to eventually get rid of the word just, but it still feels brand new. As Erin and I work to fill in the gaps of first responder needs, we've started Copper Warrior, which is our coaching service that works with first responders to take them to the next level of full optimization. So we're either taking them through the therapeutic process, we're seeing that they're recovered from trauma in enough of a way to be able to take their growth to the next level. And so we wanted to be able to look at a first responder's wellness journey and say, okay, the person who's not ready or doesn't think they have a problem, let's throw out ATTD so they can listen privately. And then we wanted to cover the people who had critical incidents and needed immediate intervention, as well as the folks who are like, okay, this has changed the trajectory of my well-being, and I want to talk to somebody who gets my job. And that was Whole House. And then the next gap that we saw was, what do we do for the first responders that aren't, in the throes of marital discourse or extreme symptoms of PTS? And how do we get them to the place where their lives just aren't trauma-free or drama-free, but that it actually allows them to live that their best life possible? And that's where we threw into the mix Copper Warrior. And both of us, she's an ICF coach, and I have a long history of coaching. So it just kind of works out perfectly. And then no more. Like, that's all we're doing. No more.
Yeah,
businesses.
because that's, I only have one life, right? And
Yes.
Yeah. So let me ask you both this. Why first responders? What got you into wanting to work with this population when there's like a million different subgroups of human beings around the world? Why first responders?
I wanted to say, why not? No. I'll let Cinnamon use her line. I'll tell you that it was not on purpose for me by any means. In fact, my life has kind of revolved around first responders in some way, shape, or form. I have been in relationships with various first responders, not on purpose. I didn't actively choose to find someone that wore a uniform for a living. I joke and say, I think it's because I like emotionally unavailable folks, and I like to be the fixer, and I want to be a hero and, save the day, all those codependent, concepts. But inevitably what ended up happening for me was in 2011, I was in a relationship with a firefighter who unfortunately ended up taking his own life. And he struggled for a long time, and I could see it. I watched it. And I had this idea that I could, if I loved him hard enough, I could say, like, it would be worth sticking around. And so, I had several situations with various responders that actually really broke my heart and hurt a lot. And so when I was kind of ending my ICF training, Cinnamon had already been working with first responders for several years. And I remember when she started working with responders, I was like, good for you. Have fun with that, and she was so excited about it.
Because you know what that experience is like just from the being,
other side
in a relationship with a first responder. Yeah.
Right. But what I didn't know then that I know now was that every single situation that I had gone through in these relationships were so I could be here today. Because Cinnamon had ended up inviting me to come play along with her, with whole house. And I was like, okay, I will do this. However, I'm going to have my own people. I'm going to have my own separate coaching business. And she's like, go get your chemical dependency counselor license and come on with me and we'll do this thing. And from moment one, session one, I knew I was home. In a lot of ways, it's almost allowed me like to complete my intention of not being able to show up in a way that was supportive for the people before me that I dated. And I wasn't in a position to do anything. And of course, I'm clear that no one can save anybody but themselves. But it allowed me to have healing with whatever resentments I had in those past relationships. It allowed me to see behind the curtain, to understand, oh, they were not intentionally like just being jerks. Like they were actually very symptomatic. Their behaviors were a cry for help, infidelity and all of those things. And it allowed me to have compassion, which was very surprising because I was able to see that in their right mind, if they weren't in this space, I don't think that on a human level, they would have done that, of course. But because the pain was so deep, they were looking for outlets elsewhere. And so it allowed me not only to find forgiveness, and compassion, but to just really fall in love with this whole population in such a different way. The other reason that I love working with first responders, though, is because this is the one place in the world where I can actually just be Erin. Like I can be a little bit messy. I can pull out some big words that maybe I would get fired for if I used. I can be interruptive. Like I like to say I'm kind of small but mighty. So this is a place, like to look at me, you would think that you wouldn't think I was very tough, but I am very, very good at bringing that interruptive style, but just enough maternal compassion to make it all blend well. And so a lot of people that I've worked with prior to first responders, some loved it and some felt they were afraid or they felt threatened by the way that I get in there with intention. So it was the perfect, I don't want to call it marriage because I don't want it to get it twisted, but I definitely can see that my life's path brought me exactly where I'm supposed to be. And I can't see it any other way.
I want to pull on a thread that I saw, but I want to first get Cinnamon's response as to why first responders.
So it's always interesting to listen to Erin's answer to that question, because while I know all of that, my first thought is she didn't. Right? She didn't choose first responders because I didn't choose first responders. And the reason I say that is, I came into the first responder world as a trauma therapist. That was already like my identity. But prior to that, I had been working with human trafficking survivors. I had been working with domestic violence survivors. I had worked with homeless women and children. I had really focused my experience on women. And then I come into this, I don't want to say an opportunity, but into this experience where this group of 105 men don't want me, don't like that they need me, and somebody else, not them, is asking that I help them. Mm-hmm. And, I was just minding my own business at a community behavioral health clinic when I was asked to provide clinical services temporarily to a fire department that had had a line of duty death. And at that point, I was a big fish in a small pond. I had just moved from a major city and they didn't have any other trauma therapists. So I was like, sure, I'll take this couple month long assignment. And I had no idea what kind of like our first responders, when I say, they know what they're signing up for but they don't.
But they really don't.
Right? Like, I thought I was just going to help this group of people get through this really difficult time. And ultimately what happened was I sat through an arson trial with them and didn't know any of them, but I showed up every day. So if they needed something, I was right there. And we did this for about 8 months. Went through the first, or not the first anniversary, but the first anniversary that I had been with this department. And come spring, they were like, okay, Cinnamon, we're going to put you back where you were. And I came home one day on a Thursday and I told my husband, I want to quit my job and I want to just start serving exclusively first responders in private practice. And he was like, well, how about you not do it today? He's like, give yourself the weekend. And on Monday, I submitted my resignation. And within a month, I was brick and mortar. And it was insane how word of mouth, having another first responder vouch for you, and the fire under these people so desperately needing services and finally feeling like they had permission along with a good source of compassion to provide that. And at that point, we just haven't looked back. And what I will say is, you do not pick first responders. First responders pick you.
Yeah.
Because I could have done all of that and then I could have sat in an office and waited and they could have never shown up. The only way you get to be successful in this particular line of work is if they believe that you are truly there for them, that you're compassionate, that you're understanding, you're not judgmental, and that you can bust some balls along with the best of them. And like Erin said, there is a freedom that comes from working with this population that is very different than working from other trauma survivors, where you can never really pull out the story or the saying like, cool story, bro, as Erin does often. Like it's an ability to land the difficult thing. And I know that they're willing to hear it, right? That you don't have to pull all those punches because of some perceived fragility. And I also have the freedom to not have to watch my mouth. I get to cuss a lot more than I did before. And that right there takes off a whole lot of stress.
Yeah. It's amazing when I finish my film, and there's a little bit of swearing in the film, and I left all that in just because I think it's a connection point with some first responders. Within the first 3 minutes, there's a shit, and I think that kind of like, okay, this isn't just some glossed over thing, and so it's a thing, it's a thing with first responders, as you all well know. But the thread I wanted to pull, that was something that Erin said, is that first responders, they can start exhibiting this behavior that is a result of all the stuff that they've experienced over the years. And oftentimes their fellow workers, their agencies, their people think they're just being assholes. And they're just being, pieces of work that, why are you being such an asshole? When it's really the result of the mess that they've been in for the past X number of years. And for example, I'm going to call him Bob. This guy I know, retired law enforcement, was, in a big agency, and he's just he's given the cold shoulder by all of his former coworkers, because he made some bad choices and went down a path where, he had some struggles, and now he's just being thrown aside. He said, and he told me, it was because I was in this bad place of all these things, all these dead bodies I've seen and had to document and all this stuff. That's what was affecting me. And they just think I'm an asshole, and I'm really not. And they just think I'm just doing all these stupid things because I'm stupid. He said, but it's not. It's because of all these experiences that I've had. What's your response to someone like that? And how do you help not only them, but the people around them to figure this out?
Well, I hope Bob got some support after hearing that story. If Bob is a real guy, and Bob is real, no matter what, right?
Yeah.
That there are many, many Bobs out there. And I think that's the tricky part. And that's also something that when we notice people around us suddenly turning into a-holes that weren't that way, that's a sign. That is a red flag and an opportunity to be like, hey, buddy, I'm noticing this. What's up? But they're not taught to do that, And the truth is, and Cinnamon can get into this from more of the clinical side, but with trauma, with this cumulative stress, with most of the time some early childhood stuff that has happened, their brain becomes overloaded. It actually changes. And we talk a lot about this idea of becoming addicted to your internal drugs, right? Like all of the different chemicals that get dumped. And that's including negative and the yummy ones, as I call them, and the ones that aren't so great. And so it's like this idea of looking for this quick fix over and over and over and over, kind of how external substances kind of alter things for you. That same thing can happen internally. And so that's kind of that question we could talk about for 2 weeks. There's so much that can be added into that. But that was like the first thing that comes to my mind is like, okay, this is a red flag. If you're noticing someone behaving this way, say something. And because we don't just suddenly turn into assholes. She makes fun of me when I say that. Overnight.
I'm like, we're on the playground in 6th grade and she's so bold. She said a-hole. Like it was so close. Oh my God.
Well, it's not after the tones drop. I want to be respectful of his.
No, you say whatever you want. If I need to, I'll bleep something out. But yeah, go ahead. Just go for it.
Okay, thanks. Permission slip. But I mean, I think that this is such a taboo thing, as we know. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here talking about it. But it's a very, very common thing to become very short fused. To be very agitated. And that's just a symptom of.
And even going beyond that to maybe make some life choices that aren't good or perhaps not even legal.
Of course.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
it's that chase. It's the idea of the chase. It's that adrenaline dump. It's the dopamine hits. It's that need for belonging and feeling special and important and all the things that it creates inside. And that's why when I said, I know my partner years ago was having multiple relationships with multiple women. He was law enforcement. And when I found that out, I was, of course, devastated. Now, I wasn't a peach either. I got to say, I wasn't innocent in this. And it crushed me. But now that I know what I know, I'm not justifying it. I would have preferred that he got help, but I can understand the amount of pain. Like I had learned after we broke up that he was in an officer involved shooting 2 years into his career. So very young in his career, where he shot some kid and the family is still chasing him, like, trying to, crush his career, crucify. Yeah. And I'm like, oh yeah. Okay. Well, now that I know that, but even if I knew that then, I wouldn't have been able to understand, the significance of what that meant. But now
Cinnamon,
I do.
How can that person, whether they're working, how can they, help their fellow workers to understand that?
So
how could they understand it themselves even?
Sure. Well, and I think we're much better at seeing things like from the outside, right? Like when it's us, we are blinded. But when we see it in someone else, if we know what the options are, like I used to actually have a training called He's Not an Asshole, He's Symptomatic. Because that was the biggest thing that I would hear about people who just kind of like fell off, right? Like they weren't who they were when they started with me. And we got into the service in the same year and like, I don't know what's happened to them. And like Erin said, there is a high rate of complex PTS adding developmental trauma. And so if you don't have a lot of coping skills, right? Like we can go on days about the idea of resiliency. But the premise is that you bounce back. And kids who have been in abusive or neglectful households, they don't have resiliency. That's not resiliency. That is tolerance, right? Like they're not bouncing back. They're just surviving. And what we do know is they do not have healthy coping skills. So when stuff starts going wrong in their adult life, they don't have that healthy fallback of, asking for help and it being okay, having somebody come and talk to them and express concern and not get super angry and defensive. And what Erin was talking about, I would call it the addiction to peril, right? Like they've been addicted to adrenaline since the first time they hid under a bed when they heard a parent come home intoxicated and ready to be violent, right? So that's where you end up with, all these people making poor choices. What we think is like, dude, how did you think that was going to be a good idea? Well, they didn't think. They were just feeling, and they were feeling that rush, that addiction to peril. And, we have something called biological rudeness, where if you come at me, I'm immediately going to get protective. I'm going to get defensive. I can't hear what you have to say. I need you not to come at me with, dude, what the hell are you doing? You're being a complete jackass. I need you to come to me going, man, I got to tell you, I'm a little bit concerned. I know who you are. I've been your friend for years. I know how much you love your wife. I remember our conversation the first time you came back after paternity leave and how much you love those kids. And I don't know what happened, but you're scaring me. Like, I just don't see that guy anymore. And I'm concerned. And we don't teach men how to be compassionate towards each other. And, obviously we know that women are first responders, and we know that they also have issues. And sometimes their issues are even more severe because they need to do what people with penises do without the penis. So they got to do it even bigger. But predominantly we're talking about men, and we do a really shitty job socializing boys to get them to understand their emotions and, how to talk about them and what they're called and how to feel them and be okay with that. And we're doing much better with these incoming generations that my generation of Gen Xers are always bitching about, which ironically, I want to ask, are you sure we're not jealous? Because they realized they had the ability to say, no, you're not going to do that to me. Whereas my generation, we just took it. And so I think when we think about PTS, we are thinking about flashbacks and nightmares and all of what I call the Hollywood symptoms, the ones that we see in movies. What we're not as familiar with are going to be the change in worldview. Find me a first responder who hasn't changed how they see the world, themselves, and other people since they started doing this work, right? The high risk behaviors when they knowingly self-identify as adrenaline junkies. The idea of, I just seem to be getting mad 0 to 100 these days. Yeah, that's a PTS symptom. They have this idea of what PTS is and who gets to have it. And there's a disconnect there. And then you add in socialization, adverse childhood experiences, a lack of resiliency, an imposition of just trying to survive, the biological rudeness of defensiveness. And we kind of should expect them. And also on top, they don't sleep well. So why would we ever think in the first 100 years of the fire service and however long law enforcement has been going on, that this was not going to f you up? What did we think we were doing to these people by saying, you're a hero, and if you can't handle this, you should get out. So everybody is in denial and not talking about it. But when I say it like that, who thought they were going to get out of this without it impeding their best version of self that is authentic and free and full of joy?
Do you think this is a kind of maybe a question that's a little bit off topic, but do you think that historically things were easier back then? 50s and 60s, the crimes maybe weren't as heinous as they are now. Do you think that, or do we just have more access to all this media and there's stuff to see these things and experience them?
I think we definitely have more access to see directly what's happening, whether it's social media or body cams. We also have technology that it has advanced us medically. So when we're looking at a decreased number of fatalities, that's just because we can make people live.
Right.
It
doesn't
doesn't
save lives
mean
in
that
the emergency room.
Yeah.
Right.
And, even just looking, like, let's just talk about fire service, very particularly the materials that go into building and furnishing a home. Back in the day, they had way more time. They had more fires because they didn't have all the safety mechanisms in place, but that shit burnt slower.
Yeah.
They
didn't
had
have all the
more time
glue that we have today.
Right.
in there. Yeah.
I mean,
and now
our
it's
houses
like,
are glued together, basically.
yeah, they have they have way less time. They have way less fires, but they also have a huge increase in EMS runs, but they have less time to put out that fire, and those fires are more dangerous than they have ever been. So it's like, yes, the numbers have reduced, less people are dying, but the risk and intensity of that work has gotten much harder. And so it's a hard thing to compare on the surface when there are so many mitigating factors that go into this. But no, I think what's happened is that we just saw a lot of people lying and families hiding, abuse, addiction, suicide. Like, there's a lot of ways to die by suicide. And one of them is slowly but surely, right? So I don't think it's any worse. I think it's actually like only getting better, not because things are better, but because they finally have permission to talk about how bad things actually are.
If they choose.
If they choose.
Yeah.
And they have the permission.
In your work in your area, and I believe you're in Ohio, is that correct? So in your area, how have things evolved even in the past years that you've been working in the first responder community? Have you seen progress, and have you seen agencies willing to address these issues in a better way?
I love that you said agencies, specific, because we just had this conversation last week with a bunch of our past guests, and where Cinnamon is in Cincinnati, they're grassroots. Like, the way that they're doing things down there, it's working. There's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff in that tri-state area. And to go an hour and a half north where I am in Columbus, it is very, very different. Like, I know CPD, they have their own kind of organization within their agency. And it's like, you ain't getting in unless you're part of this. It's like, you got to know the secret handshake. So it's very different in that sense. Now, we have been very surprised to see, even like, there's a volunteer fire department in Athens County, Ohio, and they are all about this. And these people are volunteering to come and listen to us speak for 2 hours about the brain, and they are showing up huge. And so it's so crazy to watch how some places are really, really bought in. And that's because their chief is like, you know what, guys? Yeah, this whole time I thought I was okay. Now I'm realizing I'm not. And so we're all going to get help. It's because the people that actually, need to be speaking or speaking. It has been my experience. But it still feels very, very patchy. There have been many days where I'm like, I don't feel like we're making the progress because we know how hard we're working. You know, I mean, this is our blood, sweat, tears. We are going to sleep thinking about this and waking up thinking about this, but that's not the truth for everybody else. So progress, yes, but you know, we're watching people have petitions signed to get 8 hours of training in the academy on mental health alone. And that is like pulling teeth. So progress, yes. And it's still a trickle in my experience, especially when I get to go to Cincinnati and hang out and it feels different down there.
What's different there's in Cincinnati and why?
So Erin used the phrase grassroots. And I feel like it is the people with boots on the ground or in the cruisers that are they're initiating their own, like they're demanding that we start taking care of each other.
So it's not necessarily the leadership, the command staff.
It's not the leadership.
Okay.
And it's not, 5 different organizations or the EAP or, like Erin said, internal. We get to be the gatekeepers. Those of us with the boots on the ground are the ones who are kind of like opening that door. And for us, it's like, come on in. The more the merrier. Like we need people that care. And now I can't compare us to like California or Texas or Chicago or Colorado. Somebody may come back here, and I've had this happen where they're like, you guys are so behind the curve. I only know what I know. And even as much as I talk to other people, it's still hard if you're not fully in that area. But we've got other groups who are like holding that door closed, and they're, saying things more like, well, we're going to need to talk to a certain person to see if we can let you in, or we're going to need to, and it's not just vetting, but it's more of like, we have to decide if we already have an interested party that covers that, or we need to decide if we believe in that intervention to decide if we're going to let you in. And to me, there's a lot of things that are teachable once you get inside the fence. One of them is not passion. And if you are coming and asking to be admitted and you care about this population and you believe you have something to offer, we can do anything once you're inside. But I get emails all the time. Why don't they want me? Why won't they let me in? They said they won't let me in here, but maybe they'd let me in here. But then I called them and they quit calling me back, or they said that I couldn't have a table at their thing. And it's like, why are we turning away passionate people? I can help somebody get pointed in the right direction. I've got I can have somebody stuff a swag bag if they're passionate. So I think that's the big thing, is that the mentality of what it looks like to protect the first responder population from whatever they think the big monster is. And whereas we are down here and it's less clinical led, it's more peer led, like actual first responders who don't have the clinical experience outside of being a peer, that they're like, bring them in and we'll sort them out once they're in the corral, but don't keep them off the ranch.
Yeah. Well, and we know that there's so much lack of trust.
Sure.
Like,
it's a huge issue with all first responders.
Right. And of course it is.
Yeah.
Like, if I saw and experienced the things that they did, I probably would have some trust issues too.
Yeah.
So they, my part of it, I think, is that they do want to make sure that they're not going to get duped. Like, what if this person actually can't hack it? And then I'm the one that said they can come. And then what does that create? Like, could that create this whole ripple effect of folks not wanting to get help at all. Cause we watched that happen too, where they went to one clinician and that person started crying. And next thing you know, the responder is the therapist to the therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're like, I ain't going back. That's crap,
Mm-hmm.
you know? But it's like, it's this very almost like fragile situation that we do get. But as Cinnamon said, it's kind of like, we're also watching a lot of people that want to be of service to this population that deserve a chance.
Mm-hmm.
So
for both of you,
can I add just a little bit to that? Because there's one piece of that puzzle that neither one of us mentioned. And that is, just because you may do an evidence-based intervention, like I'll use EMDR, right? Like somebody that does EMDR is almost like their vetting process is going to be very different. But what does it mean when they're like, oh, that's a new way to make money? Mm-hmm. I'll say that I'm available for first responders. And because I do EMDR, my vetting may not be as rigorous as somebody who maybe doesn't have that, but has a connection or a passion, or what Erin and I feel is absolutely crucial is the personality. You can have a lot of things going for you, but if you don't have a personality that connects with them, it's not going to work. So yeah, that would be, I do think that there's a lot of people who say, well, I saw a first responder, and so yes, I treat first responders, or this is another niche group that I can, get my name on a resource page and generate more income from. And that is, yeah.
So have either of you spent time in a police car on a ride along?
Many times. Yeah, many times I probably shouldn't have been.
Not in the back seat, right?
No, well, yes, and also
yes,
but
that did happen. There are photos, though. They did let us keep our phone and take pictures of it.
But that was part of what was so exciting about being in that relationship with that cop was he would come pick me up on shift, and I would do quote unquote ride-alongs, which now I know I'm like, oh my gosh, that wasn't legal at all. Like, had something happened, that would have been really, really bad for him and me.
No release signed.
No release. So there would be plenty of nights where I would participate in we'll call them ride-alongs. Yeah.
So I think the answer is yes, because I had even just that exclusive 8 months of working with a department where my bosses never seemed to know where I was. I was on a truck in a medic unit all the time because I could be. And that is an experience that most clinicians that work with this population, unless they are employed by the city, township, whatever, we need billable hours. No agency is just going to let you go for 8 months and ride around. So I definitely know what a privilege that was. The most important thing that I took from that is the things that don't even register for them were a slap in the face to me, right? Like when you go into someone's home and maybe it's not, this bloody scene of what we typically think of as going to cause trauma, it's that wonderful, kind old lady that we just picked up off the floor to put back in her lazy boy where she is for 23 hours of the day, does not have a single person that is coming to check on her. And she is hungry and she goes to the bathroom in that chair and she sleeps in that chair and she's embarrassed and she doesn't want to call. And there is no community resource that we can call and notify of this horror and neglect. And they are going to say that is significant enough for us to put our eyes on it. They're like, oh yeah, like, so no one's beating her. Fantastic. She doesn't meet the threshold. So especially when you have grown up in certain environments that may not give you the opportunity to be exposed to those things, that is a huge, impactful thing that we consider, or they consider, low level, right? Seeing how the other half lives is shocking, but because there's no blood or guts and it is not considered trauma in the way that we think about it. So that was, I think, what was the most important takeaway for me in doing that, was how there is no run that doesn't have the potential to be traumatizing.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how long it takes for a firefighter, a medic, a cop to be, how many of those scenes does it take for them to really be impacted? And for it to like, or even, I guess better, I guess a better way to say it is, how long does it take for them to be not impacted, not appear to be impacted?
So
how many
desensitized?
Desensitized, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a trick question too, because often they're coming into this already with a certain level of significant events in their life.
Sure.
They're coming into this with a certain ability to avoid, to cope, to survive. And a lot of folks are coming in, they're like the fourth generation responder in their family or veteran or, in military. And it's like, they're taught way before they ever like get a badge or a gun or a hose or whatever. And so even if it is affecting them, they're going to convince themselves that it's not because it's not supposed to. That's the belief, of course. But of course it's going to affect you because you're a human being with the same brain as anybody else. And Cinnamon will joke like nobody gets into half of these professions because they were, like there's a design. They're already designed to do it. They're designed to go after the job that they're chasing that adrenaline. I mean, or that there's risk, it's just part of typically people's upbringings. We go all around the country talking about childhood adversity and ACEs. That's kind of our jam, which sounds really sick to say that out loud, but we know how much this population is impacted and often why they pick this profession. And so we want them to understand that too, so they have the upper hand in how they cope.
I want to dig into that a little more because I remember your presentation in Kentucky last year.
Oh, yeah.
What's the average ACEs score for a first responder?
7.
7 out of 10.
Out of 10. And it takes a 4 to be clinically significant. And it's, wild.
That's just mind-blowing to most of us.
And for those of your listeners that are not familiar, when you break down the 7 out of 10 means 7 questions you answered yes to out of a total of 10 yes or no questions. And there's really 3 areas that they cover: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. You're looking at 3 types of abuse: physical, emotional, and sexual. You're looking at 2 types of neglect, emotional and physical. And then you're looking at several types of household dysfunction, which is incarceration, substance abuse, mental health, domestic violence, and what am I missing? That might be it. If it's not, I'll have to get it back to you. But so those questions cover all of those things. And it's very rarely do you see anybody who is fully aware, like self-aware, answering a 0. If it's almost like if you've got 1, you've probably got 2. And if you've got 2, it's a good chance you've got 3. But it takes a little bit of time to be introduced to the ACEs and give out your answers. And then you sit with it and you do the work and your score goes up. The more work you do, the more frequently we see scores go up. I had my biggest situation or example of that. I had a guy come back to me as a 0 when he did his intake paperwork because we send out the ACEs because I don't want you to be influenced by what I'm about to teach you when you fill it out the first time. And I watched somebody go from a 0 to an 8 simply because I sat down with them and walked through the questions with them. And that was after a few months of working together. So I knew some stories And so if they
Mm-hmm.
did answer no, I'm like, well, what about this? This is what this question kind of means. And their final score was an 8.
Mm.
And, as far as the presentation that you saw us do, even going back all the way to, he's not an asshole, he's symptomatic. What we do now is we will identify the standard, most common bad behaviors that would get somebody labeled as that asshole. And I will point to the exact part of your brain that trauma has either caused a dysregulation in, how it's operating, whether it's making it underactive or overactive. I can, because it's one thing to say, well, you're being a jerk. Well, that's because the, PTS or whatever. No, that's a jerk move. And I'm like, let me show you where in your cingulate cortex, your inability to detect error comes into play, which is why you see people dying on mountains in an argument that they don't need to, or they don't stop it. They keep pushing it long after everybody else knows it's over. Right? Like, let's talk about the short-term memory loss in your hippocampus. Let's, talk about your clumsiness that comes out of your insula. Like, I can help point all those asshole behaviors right back to an injured area of the brain. And it's injured for probably 80% of first responders before they ever get sworn in. And then after that, it's exposure.
Yep.
So is the ACEs score administered at the academy, in any agency, anywhere?
No. I mean, maybe, who knows? Like, times have changed. None that I'm familiar with. I think it would be.
I would say the most likely scenario is that I know this, we talked about this in corrections, where they learn about it and they learn about trauma, so they know how to treat and handle inmate situations or people on the street. It's never pointed back at them.
Because isn't the average incarcerated person has the same score?
Yep.
Yes. The average score in the federal penitentiary system in the United States is a 7. And there is a gentleman he's a retired Marine, and now he's a retired Seattle firefighter. And my last stalking check, he is actually a clinician now. And I heard him speak once in 2019, and he said, first responders, veterans, military folks, whatever, and criminals are 2 branches on the same tree.
Wow. That's a powerful statement.
Yeah.
And probably most first responders would be like, that's bullshit.
Oddly enough, they're like, that kind of does make sense.
Yeah,
but if you think about the adversity that is the developmental trauma, you give me an SOP and a badge and I become a community hero and well respected, or somebody's thanking me for my service as a military person. And I might be coming from a household where I was repeatedly told I was a piece of shit. I was not good enough. I was not smart enough. I was never going to become anything. I was an inconvenience. I was an embarrassment. And now you're going to call me a hero? Like, hell yeah, sign me up for that. Or I want to be the person that I didn't have, or I want to be the person that finally did show up for me. Or the other route.
Yeah.
It's surprisingly, they're actually not shocked at all, because so many folks that we talk to that are first responders will say, man, I was like a minute away from going to jail. Like, I should have been. I was the kid on the streets causing trouble. And then for some reason, I became a cop. Right. So they're actually not surprised. And
or they have a family member. Right. That did
it's interesting because in my film, Officer Palmer, Desiree, she has a sister who's still today in her 40s in active addiction, heroin use, and other opioids. And she said when she was 12, she said, my sister was running the streets and doing all the crazy things that, older teenagers do, and getting herself into trouble. And I was riding with cops. I had a choice to do what my sister did or I could ride with the cops. And that's what got her into law enforcement.
Yeah. And they grew up in the same house.
Yeah.
With the same parents.
Yep.
And one went one way and one went the other. Right.
Right. Like
Not.
different parents given different years and different ages. And I would say it is way more common for a younger sibling that has witnessed the negative trajectory to like be able to at least have that example to choose an alternate path. And the oldest sibling doesn't. But we also know that oftentimes the oldest siblings in those households become premature adults, and they're what we call the golden child, or, you know, the lost child, or the hero, and they step in and fill those gaps. And then they're way more mature than they should be at a particular developmental age. And then it's the younger siblings that might go awry. So there's scenarios for both. And I'm a classic scapegoat, comedian in the dysfunctional role list. And my older sibling was the perfect child. But then if you look at Erin and her younger brother, Erin was the oldest and the train wreck, and her younger brother did the things right because he was in a house watching her do what she did. So when we say we love talking about this stuff, it's not that we like to see people suffer. And I think Erin kind of briefly referenced this a bit ago. We don't do this job because we had idyllic lives before this and we're curious about how the other half lived, right? Like Erin and I have had if we died today, we lived enough life for a couple lifetimes on the other side of the trek, so to speak. So to us, it's more of like, I'm always intrigued by how our lives affect our lives. And to be able to help people understand that are busy putting out fires or keeping our community safe. Like, I'll do that work and you go do your work and then I'll fill you in.
So, and this hour is going by so quickly. I want to kind of bring it back to that first responder who's listening to this, and maybe they are that person that I described earlier as Bob, who is just getting a bunch of flack from his or her fellow workers because they have become an asshole, and maybe they don't even know why, and probably they don't know why. So I want each of you to answer this. What's a first step? What should Bob do? What's his first step? What's his first move?
I would love to say, make an appointment with a therapist, but it doesn't even have to be that far. You know, it's all about relentless responsibility. And we know how we show up in some way, shape, or form. Or at least for me, like if I'm in some kind of mood and I am watching myself being feisty and on edge, I am very, very clear that it's happening. Like I'm able to say like something's off. Now, that doesn't mean I will actually address it, but I get on my own nerves, you know? And I think that if we have that glimpse of, wow, that was kind of a little bit much how I reacted, because shame drives us as human beings in a lot of ways. So when we are yelling at our kids, or we say something awful to our wife, or we snap at the rookie, or whatever we do, like we know we did it. And if that is not our norm, then we might want to at least say, you know what, to somebody. It doesn't have to be a therapist, although I would highly recommend somebody that's a professional that could help you sort through it. But just saying, you know, something might be a little off with me, to somebody that a trusted person, you know?
That takes some balls though.
Vulnerability. Oh God, that is a cuss word, but that is the only way out is through. I mean, okay, so That is what keeps people stuck. That is what drives people to put a gun to their head, because it is uncomfortable to say, this ain't me. Something's off. Mm-hmm. And we get that. You know, we suffered for years before we ever asked for support. And look what we do for a living, you know, because we think that we've got this. We've had it for a long time. So why wouldn't we have it now? But eventually our brain's like, you know what? System overload. I can't do this on my own anymore.
We're good at lying to ourselves.
Yeah.
Erin's dad has this saying that we joke about all the time. He says, "Take my advice. I'm not using it." and I think we are really good at looking at other situations, but I think we misunderstand why. And it's if you have a dog in the fight, it's not going to be as clear because you see and feel all the mitigating factors, right? Mm-hmm. All of the reasons why not. And doesn't mean that the solution or the next right thing isn't the same thing. It's just there's more reasons to be hesitant. And honestly, I wrote down the same thing she said. I wrote down vulnerable. I wrote down peer, meaning like a peer support, and a friend. And whenever we get asked questions like that, my first thought is, oh, the first step makes it tricky. I can tell you that there's all kinds of things to do. But if I'm asking you to go to a peer or a friend, like you said, that takes a lot of vulnerability. No one's going to do that as a first step if they haven't done something to address their vulnerability and figured out that it actually is the bravest, most courageous thing that you can do is to go to a buddy at work who's known you for a minute and be like, "Hey, can I ask you to kind of tell me what you think about me? What do you think about how I've been behaving?" Right? Like, my wife is saying this, or I'm thinking that, and I won't hold it against you, but can you tell me honestly what you're seeing? And if that takes courage, like that is not a wimpy thing to do, the way that we've categorized vulnerability as a weakness. And if you're concerned about doing it with a friend, you can reach out to a peer, like a peer support, and ask a version of that question. Because even if that new peer doesn't know me, if I'm asking the question, I already know something's up. And all I'm looking for is validation from my friend. But I can go to a peer and say, here's what's happening. And all of our clients, if asked, will tell you that they lied about not knowing what was going on. Like they may say, that they didn't have a problem when their wife begged them to go get help. I'm fine. And then if I ask them, were you? They're like, no, absolutely not. So we intuitively, like I always say, like, take your hands, one on your heart, one on your gut, sit there real quiet for a minute and just ask yourself, am I okay? You already know the answer. And how long do you want to sit knowing that answer, not being okay and not doing a thing about it? We get one rodeo and we see too many people that don't do this, and they're rodeo much sooner than they need to. And I think everybody kind of gets to some point where they're at a crossroads. Either they keep doing what they've always done, or they decide they want to do something different. And I think the more we do this work, the more people will be making the choice to do something different, because it's not as scary as when they thought they would not only have to change everything, but lose everybody's respect.
I would actually venture to say it is as scary, because it is scary to face the reality of stuff. So I would say that it's still scary, and that doesn't mean you stop. That doesn't mean you don't do it, because it's a lot more accepted. Anyway. Right. It's a lot more accepted now. And as Cinnamon is speaking, if you aren't in a place where you feel like you are quite ready to open your mouth and be verbal with somebody about it, there are a million bazillion resources out there. There is so many podcasts. There are so many books written by responders talking about their story. Like, I would invite people, just educate yourself. Just be curious. Now, don't go down to some Google rabbit hole, a WebMD. Don't self-diagnose, but listen to your fellow peers that are out there talking about this stuff, and just be curious about, okay, I'm going to listen to this with an open mind in the privacy of my car or my closet or wherever you got to be to pretend like you're not doing it. And just notice, what do I actually have in common with this person? What sounds familiar? Don't be looking for what makes you different to prove yourself right, that you're okay, but be curious about, what is this person's story offering me that I actually can relate to? And that's the thing. That's exactly why we started After the Tones Drop, because we know people aren't ready. And we have people and guests on there, and we interview people, but we spend a lot of time in the education world explaining all different kinds of stuff, everywhere from trauma on the brain to how to not fight with your wife. Because we want folks to have that as a resource to understand. And we explain it in a way that's not all clinical, because gosh, not everybody knows this stuff, So that would be what I could say could be the thing before the thing, is to, there's every day, I swear to you, there is another podcast that I'm like, oh, another first responder podcast, So if we're not your jam, or Conrad's not your jam, there's a million people that are.
For sure.
But obviously your people's jam if they're listening to the show right now. But
if you can hear me, right?
Right.
I would even throw in, when I would do trainings in departments initially, I would always have up front with me like a stack of cards, or like business cards or brochures or whatever. And I realized that nobody was picking them up. And so what I did was I sometimes I handed them out at each seat, but I said, grab a business card so you have it in your pocket when your buddy finally comes and wants to talk to you. Right. So, and then all of a sudden I had no business cards left over at the end of a training. And I think it's, even if you go to your captain or your whoever and say, hey, I want to go to this mental health conference. Will you guys give me the time off and even maybe pay for it? Because I don't know enough about this, but I want to be ready. Right. And we can do wonders making it about somebody else. And it's a entry point into this world.
I think that little exercise you did, that little exercise you showed with your hand in your heart, hand on your gut, I think anyone who wants to be the best version of themselves needs to do that on a regular basis.
100%. We have all the answers. There is not one single answer that we do not possess that we get from outside of us. Yeah. We know.
Wow. Well, this has been a great conversation, as I knew it would be with you two. So I want to, for our audience, how can they find you guys? How can they find your podcast? And if there's someone, a leader who wants to bring you in for training, how can they do that as well?
Well, afterthetonesdrop.com is our podcast. We have copperwarrior.com, which is the coaching program. And then we have whole-house.com. So depending on what they're looking for, if someone wants to invite us in for trainings, then whole-house.com is the place to go. And that will also lead you to the podcast and Copper Warrior. So that's kind of the one-stop shop would be Whole House.
Everything's on there.
And we're also on like every social media avenue there is. Well, maybe not Reddit or, like there's some.
If you Google After the Tones Drop podcast, you will find us.
Sure.
And we make it real simple. All of our emails are just our first name. So Erin at Copper Warrior, Erin at whole-house, Erin at afterthetonesdrop.com, or I guess that's info. And then Cinnamon the same way. And what we can do, Conrad, is we can give you our link tree. So with one click, they can get to every single
Everything
of those websites. And if you have a need that we have yet to figure out a way to address, I will give you a couple dollars. We tried to seal that up where we're not a safety net that has we're not a safety net. We're a layer of safety saran wrap. There are no holes.
That's awesome. Any final words from either of you?
Thank you.
Thank
you for having us and for doing this and for taking, we're going to see you. Our plan is to see you again soon because we're going to go to Akron for the viewing with AK. Thank you for the same reason that you asked us. Like, you kind of walked into this and caught the bug, and there wasn't necessarily anything in it for you as far as like you weren't married to one, your dad wasn't one, but you saw what we see as this community that deserves to be healthy. And so thank you for being a constant source of that, and also being another cool person that we get to do this work with.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm doing I'm in the best part of my life right now, doing what I'm doing, and whether I get paid or not, I would still do it. And it's and for the most part, I don't get paid, but that's okay.
Right. I was like, you get paid? How do you do that?
This is charitable work.
It's charitable work, right? But I love it. And here's my whys, because I was on the receiving end of medics that came in one day. I did something stupid. I didn't drink enough. And I drink water enough. Let me clarify that. Didn't drink enough water while I was exercising. I about passed out, and my son called 911, and in come the medics. And I want healthy people showing up when it's my emergency.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll be a t-shirt. I'm on that. Can this be a t-shirt? Like kick of slogans and stuff? Yeah. And that's absolutely right. And that's what we try to say. Like, if you're going to be the helper out there in the world, you got to be healthy.
Yeah.
Like, we need you to be healthy.
Yep.
And sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. And we're moving in the right direction. I got to believe it. We got to get you on our podcast now.
I'd love to. Anytime.
Especially since we already have a t-shirt quote. I want healthy people to show up when it's my emergency.
I just asked for 10% of the sales. Okay.
Yeah. See? Oh, yeah. That's what
absolutely.
Gotta make a little bit here,
Right.
Yeah. Can I get myself a cup of coffee so I can drink it when I'm doing my interviews? Well, we get it.
Seriously, thank you so much. It's been great getting to know you all, and look forward to seeing you in Ohio and hanging out and continue to do the work. You take care of yourselves. Stay strong.
Absolutely.
Do the things that you need to do to be healthy and strong, and together we'll make a difference for someone.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you for having us.
Ladies, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I'm so glad we were able to work it out and have you on the podcast. I really enjoyed my conversation with you. And hey, if you're sticking around to this part of the show, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being a subscriber. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button. I really appreciate that. And be sure to visit our website, ptsd911movie.com, and where you can see all the dates of the upcoming screening events that we're having around the country. We'll be all over the country at various times throughout the next year. So please join us there. And if your city's not listed there, go to the website, fill out a screening form, and let's make plans to come to your city. We'd love to be there to present the PTSD 911 documentary in your town. And I want you to remember this: if you are not alone, if you need someone to talk to and don't know where you can turn, you can dial 988 for help. Until next time, be well, take care of yourself and those around you, and go out and do something great in the world.